Thanks be to God. Thank you. As I said at the beginning, our theme for the day, seeing the invisible God. It's so hard to understand, isn't it, when there are things about that we can't or don't see. How do we understand them? So I sort of did a bit of, brain thinking, and I was thinking about things which we can't see, but we're really familiar with. And the first thing that came to mind was the wind. We can't actually see the wind, however hard we try, but what we can do, we can hear it as it whistles through the trees or around our gardens. We can see the impact of the wind when we see the leaves or branches fall from trees, or the roofs flying off even. We can feel the wind on our faces when we battle our way along a cliff on a windy day. But no, we can't actually see the wind. But do we believe it's there? Of course we do. Do we experience its power? Yes, of course we do. We don't actually have to see it to believe in it. There's another one. What about electricity? Can we see that? In the same way, no, we can't. We can experience the power when we switch on a light or an appliance and know that without the flowing current, nothing could work. We might know enough to know how electricity is produced, but by harnessing power, sometimes from the wind itself. When we were in Scotland earlier this year, we visited an information centre at the hydropower centre, and it was fascinating learning about the moving of water and the power that can be made from it into electricity. The same parallels work. Just as I spoke about the wind, looking for clues can help us to understand something is there, which is really hard for us to understand. And that's exactly what Paul is doing when he's writing to the Colossians. The reading last week introduced the theme of his epistle. The church at Colossae had quite a difficult time. I don't know if you know anything much about Colossae itself and how the church came to be there. I didn't. I know a little bit more now. So in my research, I found out some of the basics. Colossae was an ancient town built on a major trade route through the Lycus Valley in the Roman province of Asia Minor, which is now the southwestern corner of modern-day Turkey. It was nearby to Laodicea, and if we know our Revelations, we know Laodicea was one of the churches mentioned there, and around 120 miles from Ephesus. In its heyday, it was an important commercial centre, but it was destroyed by 2 earthquakes. After the first one in AD 17, it was rebuilt, but after the second one in AD 60, it never regained its original importance, and from AD 400, it ceased to exist at all. Paul had planted the church in Ephesus, and from that had radiated other new churches in the area, and one of them was thought to be the church at Colossae. And we read that it was Epaphras who was likely to be the one who'd founded it. Paul was very familiar with that church, and the opening of the letter to the Colossians, which we read last week, gave a huge amount of encouragement to them. He'd obviously heard very good things about them. It's thought that Paul actually wrote this letter when he was in prison sometime around AD 60. However, he'd had contacts with this church, and much as he acknowledged their positive growth, he was also concerned, as it would seem some of them were in danger of going astray, and he wanted to ensure that they remained walking in the faith, following Jesus and being empowered by the Spirit. Therefore, when we reread this letter, we see him speaking against the theological errors which they could have embraced. I wonder if you hear the word theology and you almost turn off. Surely that should be left to the professionals, the academics maybe. But when we look at that meaning of that word, it isn't quite so complicated as it sounds out. The word can be split into 2 parts. The first bit, theo. It's a Greek word which simply means God. And the other word, ology. Well, we know lots of ologies, don't we? So psychology, sociology, etc., etc. But again, in the Greek, it means the study of. So the word theology simply means the study of God. Something we all do in our own ways as we seek to find our own path on the Christian way. And this is what Paul is trying to do in this letter. he is trying to help the Colossian Christians in their study of God. The first verse of our reading this morning spoke of Jesus being the image of the invisible God. In Jesus' life, ministry, and death, we can see the invisible God made visible, Jesus. Going back to the beginning of what I was saying about the invisibility of the wind or electricity, but having clues to its presence, we have lots of clues to the presence of God every day of our lives. One of the big things is we know God to be the creator and sustainer of the world. Looking around us, we can use all our senses to appreciate the beauty, the wonder, the sights, the smells. How amazing is this world we live in? And although man has done its best to destroy it, it springs up again. If you can remember back to lockdown, there were few cars on the road, people were not going out very far. And what did we see happening around us? It appeared that once again nature was flourishing. And for a while, it almost felt like we were living in a different place. God had formed the rules and laws of nature. He is the creator and sustainer of the world. Even now, I've picked up on some of the things that we used to do when we were out walking, and we stop and we see and we hear many things which perhaps bypassed us before, and we are suddenly greeted with that moment of awe and wonder. For the disciples, they had had the privilege of seeing Jesus, seeing God in Jesus. And what do we say and sing at Christmas? Jesus came. He was born as a human being. He could share our griefs, our joys, our sorrows. He knew pain and loved us so much he was prepared to lay down his life for us. God made flesh and dwelt amongst us. Even after he had been returned to heaven. A meeting on the road, Damascus Road, for Paul was a life-changing event. Previously a hater of Christians, trying to rid the world of them, he now became one of them, and his whole perception of God had changed. Jesus made the difference for him. In knowing Jesus, we are given such an abundance of clues as to who God is. Do you remember that old hymn, Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise? I felt compelled to get my old ancient and modern hymn book out and look at the words again. And there it describes God in a number of ways. And I loved verse 3 when I read the words. It's a little bit old-fashioned. It speaks about God as a life giver. To all life thou givest, to all great and small. In all life thou livest, the true life of all. It speaks of God as the unchanging one. He brings stability when all around us things seem to be crumbling. It says, we wither and perish, but naught changes thee. And the last verse ends with these words. Oh, help us to see, 'tis only the splendour of light hideth thee. God is unchanging. God is the giver of life. Some amazing truths for us to think about this morning. But Paul didn't finish his writing there. If we look at the last part of the reading, we find Paul telling the Colossian Christians to continue in their faith. Sometimes it can be really difficult to continue in faith, can't it? We all have trials that come along. We've all got problems from time to time that seem to be staring us in the face. It can almost seem easier to just get on with what needs to be done rather than seeking God through these testing times. But the comfort for Christians is to know that right through these trials, God is there for us. He's not just there for us, he is there with us. He is the one who we can't see, but we can rely on. We do know through history how God has worked through the most adverse situations, bringing comfort and peace. We also know the fact that Jesus came to bring us back to God, and that when we accepted his call to follow, that has brought us to a place of reconciliation to God, bought through his death on the cross. Without that, we have, or we would have, no hope. Paul was definitely not a boasting man. In Galatians, he told us the only thing he had to boast in was the cross of Christ. And in Corinthians, he would only boast in his weakness. Two things that were not related to his own achievements, but to God working in and through him. But here we find him speaking of what has happened in his life, not out of any sense of, I'm better than you are, but that by hearing what has happened, he can help them and encourage them to stay on track. I'm going to reread some of these verses, but I'm going to use it from the Message, as I found that somewhat easier to understand. Verses 24 and 25 say this: I want you to know how glad I am that it's me sitting here in this jail and not you. There's a lot of suffering to be entered into in this world, the kind of suffering Christ takes on. I welcome the chance to take my share in this church as part of that suffering. When I became a servant in this church, I experienced this suffering as a sheer gift, God's way of helping me serve you, laying out the whole truth. He knew that by sharing his experiences, he would be helping them. He wasn't hiding things from them. He wasn't saying, oh, well, you become a Christian and everything's marvelous. That's not what the Christian way is. The world that they lived in then in the Roman Empire was also a place of suffering, and they had many things to contend with. But he reminds them that Jesus took that suffering on his shoulders. It didn't just happen then, it still does. We need to come to him with our trials and our problems and know that he is with us through them all. I'm going to read now the last bit of that passage again from the Message. It's about the mystery. This mystery has been kept in the dark for a long time, but now it's out in the open. God wanted everyone, not just Jews, to know this rich and glorious secret inside and out, regardless of their background, regardless of their religious standing. The mystery is a nutshell. It's just this: Christ is in you, so therefore you can look forward to sharing God's glory. It's that simple. That is the substance of our message. We preach Christ, warning people not to add to that message. We teach in a spirit of profound common sense so that we can bring each person to maturity. To be mature is to be basic, Christ, no more, no less. That's what I'm working so hard at day after day, year after year, doing my best with the energy God so generously gives me. I thought that was just lovely. We preach Christ, no more, no less. Paul uses that word mystery, the mystery of the gospel. In this context, mystery is a technical term for what is hidden, what was hidden, I should say, but now is revealed. Revealed not just for the Jews, but for everyone. It is Christ, the hope living in us by the power of the Spirit that can make change. Paul speaks of this as being the energy God gives him. So what about us then? We haven't physically seen God. He is invisible to man's naked eye. But we do have the faith to see the signs of God around us, his presence. Do we see God at work in our community, in our own lives, in our world, sometimes in the most unexpected places? Are we living as a life of faith, people of God, filled with that energy Paul spoke about? Are we burdened by seeing people going the wrong way? And if we are, how can we seek to show God's way for them? Yes, I've brought lots of questions there, and some things certainly for us to think about. Jesus came to show the way. He was God, made flesh, and lived with ordinary people who became powerful. I meant by that, it became powerful. Remember those frightened people sitting in that house, and when the Holy Spirit went on them, they stopped being frightened. They went out and they preached the gospel in the most powerful way. I'm just going to hark back just slightly to something from last week's reading, which we didn't talk about, which I think really falls on from this. So in last week's reading, Paul spoke of the gospel as being an unstoppable force. In those days following out the pouring out of the Spirit at Pentecost, the numbers of people coming to faith absolutely exploded. 120, and gradually thousands were added day by day. It is still happening in many parts of the world. There is growth happening within the church. And one such country is Iran. In 1979, the number of Christians in that country was recorded as 500. Today, it is over 1 million. The church can't meet in the way that we are able. It is what we might describe as an underground church. Sometimes we feel we're being left out here in this country as we see declining numbers in our churches and people turning their backs on the traditional Christian values of our country, which was based on. But there is a piece of good news. There is a quiet revival happening in many places, with people turning to the church as they seek to find God and come to a living faith in Jesus. I was talking to somebody not so long ago who's in the Bristol area, and the Baptist churches there, and overseeing 120 of these Baptist churches. Each church is weekly receiving people seeking Jesus. Are we ready for that here? We need a faith that's re-energized and filled with the power of the Spirit as we seek here and now to grow this church in an interregnum, to grow this church, but not just in numbers, but in love and in faith, as we seek to follow the God who we can't see, but we know is there and feel his power around us. Amen. So we come to a time of